There's no point in just continuing to sanction more and more people and more entities if Russia is able to shrug it off, because instead what it is doing is pivoting to start trading with other countries around the world in the so-called global south.
Rishi Sunak is soon going to be heading over to Italy for tomorrow's G7 summit of leaders of advanced economies. Funding for Ukraine very high on the agenda. America, Joe Biden, is pushing for a deal that would use some of the interest from Russia's frozen assets held in those G7 countries. Some, including Germany and France, do not like that idea, especially as it stands. Nina Dos Santos is an international broadcaster, former CNN Europe editor, and she's on the line. Hello to you, Nina.
Hi there, John.
Hi, what are your thoughts, Nina? America, Biden, they want to support Ukraine. They want to be seen to be supporting Ukraine. But Germany and France aren't convinced, are they, about underwriting the loan and using those frozen Russian reserves? It could be a tense meeting.
Yeah, that's right. Remember that the G7, there were days when the G7 used to gather as the G8 with people like Vladimir Putin very much welcomed in places like Italy. It doesn't seem as though it was that long ago, but boy, have things changed over the last 3 years since Russia unleashed its war in Ukraine, and indeed probably over the last 10 years since we saw the first round of sanctions implemented on people close to the Kremlin back in 2015 by the EU as a result of the invasion of Crimea.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is that on the face of it, the United States, yes, is very keen to yet again ramp up the sanctions pressure on Russia. But there are skeptics who will say, well, look, all the devil is in the detail of the implementation here of these sanctions. And there's no point in just continuing to sanction more and more people and more entities if Russia is able to shrug it off, because instead what it is doing is pivoting to start trading with other countries around the world in the so-called global south. So we're talking about countries in Africa, places like Saudi Arabia. We've got this coalescing of other emerging markets as well that Russia can easily trade with,
Yes.
including oil and gas assets and, technology assets that it needs to continue its war in Ukraine. So, yes, there's going to be a big joint press conference between President Zelensky and President Biden at this G7 summit. Yes, there will be more news of sanctions and probably a big rollout of sanctions. But remember, as you were saying before, France itself finds itself with, political disarray ahead of these new snap elections that Macron has called. The German government is now weakened after those European parliamentary elections. An appetite for supporting Ukraine is looking awfully shaky in Italy and elsewhere.
So when it comes to this big question of using Russia's own reserves that are held in various European countries to provide a big loan for Ukraine, what exactly are Germany's and France's objections to that? What's worrying them?
Well, I think what's worrying a lot of countries is the implementation of, seizing these type of assets, let alone freezing them, creates a very uncomfortable precedent for these nations. Say if, for instance, there were sanctions imposed upon other countries around the world. And, if you look at London, where there's a large amount of Russian-linked wealth, it can be very difficult to unpick, seizing, then freezing these assets, releasing that money, if then you can have oligarchs who eventually can make their way through the court system and sue you for it. We've had cases that have collapsed of unexplained wealth orders from people from CIS states in the past, not linked to the war in Ukraine, but still it goes to show that the legal implementation of all of this in different countries can be quite tortuous. And so this great big idea for the United States to say, oh, let's go ahead and use all these assets as collateral conveniently enough for an amount of money that is not shy off the 60-odd billion that Congress wrangled over for so long, that affected Ukraine for so long because they couldn't get their hands on the weaponry that they needed as a result. It's convenient perhaps for one country, the world's biggest country with the big default reserve currency, but it's going to be a lot harder than some of the other member states around that G7 table.
Right. How's it going to play out then, Nino? Because these leaders in Puglia, they won't want to fall out very publicly. Will they just fudge this and put it off until sometime later?
Well, they can just carry on announcing sanctions, which is what we've seen over the last few years. There will, of course, be human rights activists who quite rightfully will say, look, you just can't not allow these type, aggression by countries like Russia to go unpunished. You have to make a point. But it is harder and harder to, as I was saying before, implement those sanctions because we're now 3 years into the war in Ukraine. And it's quite obvious that Russia has been able, and the Russian elite have been able to get their hands on expensive cars. The Times, for instance, did a great piece about how, Bentleys were making their way through nations like Azerbaijan. There's been many, many reports about how oil from Russia has been switched from one tanker to another in international waters. These types of things can still happen. I mean, even some of the most draconian sanctions on nations like North Korea have been avoided
Mm.
by virtue of having big allies next door like China. And China is becoming increasingly friendly with Russia. And as I was saying before, it's not just China, it's Russia, it's other nations around the world in the emerging market space that are increasing their trade with Russia. They're also attracting those Russian oligarchs. If you look at how many of them have now decamped, whereas they might have been in France or in the UK, they've decamped to places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Very much that sphere is pivoting to other places outside of the sanctions regime. And there's one other thing I would like to mention. It's that we've just had the St. Petersburg Economic Forum happening last week, which is Vladimir Putin's big sort of Davosian event. And there, for the first time, we saw his two daughters and another female relative of his take center stage, more prominence there for the daughters and sons of these oligarchs and ruling elite in Russia, some of whom are not actually sanctioned themselves yet.
Yeah, interesting spectacle. And speaking of political spectacles, it is interesting, isn't it, that about the British general election, and since the European Parliament elections, especially, you've got President Macron, you've got Chancellor Scholz, you've got Prime Minister Sunak, all there, all leaders under an awful lot of pressure at home.
All leaders who may not be going to the next G7 summit at this rate, given some of the polls. I mean, and particularly the one in France is a really tortuous situation for some political analysts, really trying to figure out just how risky this bet Emmanuel Macron has made. Obviously, Olaf Scholz has rejected the idea of calling elections. He's dismissed that, saying no, he doesn't have to. Even Emmanuel Macron has faced calls from the National Rally to step down. And he said, well, that's just ridiculous. Even if you get into power and get the premiership in France for Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Rally, if they were to manage to form some kind of government, Macron staunchly said, look, the French constitution is what it is. I'm serving until the end of my second term in 2027. But whatever happens now, yes, you're right. Some of these big leaders, Biden, Sunak, also Macron and Scholz looking quite weak anyway. Some of the big leaders around that G7 table don't look as secure as they may well have been
Yeah.
before. And also remember that when it comes to the G7, they can invite other people as well. And so they've invited people like Javier Milei. They've invited people like Pope Francis, Vladimir Zelensky. So there will be other leaders around there as well, like Zelensky, who probably also, are facing a very uncomfortable and potentially short-lived political future, because at some point he will have to think about whether or not to call elections
Mm.
and how to do so.
I mean, as you can imagine, Nina, we're spending a lot of time talking about the British general election and Rishi Sunak. Just a last word on Emmanuel Macron, because I'm reading in the European media, there's the doubts about Macron's decision to call this general election in France. They're just getting louder.
They are, and indeed, I remember we discussed this when I was in Brussels the other day, John, and you quite rightfully pointed out that there are examples of these famous so-called cohabitation governments in the Fifth Republic of France. But the last time there was one, it was back in the 1990s. I think it was 1997, coincidentally, the year Tony Blair had his landslide victory. We saw Jacques Chirac do this famous gamble where I think he had about 10 months left before he'd have had to call elections, but he decided to call them early to push through austerity measures that were quite unpopular with the domestic population in France. And as a result, he ended up with Lionel Jospin, a socialist prime minister who then blocked his full agenda. And it was such an embarrassment because Jospin hadn't even had a seat in parliament before actually challenging him. So people very nervous in France that this may end up being the situation that Emmanuel Macron could end up with. He could have actually brought in a right-wing government that many French people say they don't
Mm.
want. just by virtue of political vanity, if you like, the fact that he wanted to go early to try and nip this in the bud and then carry on with his legislative agenda. I suppose after we get the first round of voting in 3 weeks' time, we'll have a clearer idea. But as we've said frequently on this show, French voters vote very differently on the first round than
Yeah.
they do on the second round, especially when you have the far right leading the ballot
Yeah,
there.
I was reading a member of Macron's own party calling him a loose cannon. Let us catch up soon, Nina. Great to have you on. Nina Dos Santos there.